Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with Magnegrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit magnegrip.com.
Attention first responders, ready for a new challenge? You can turn your leadership skills into deliciousness by becoming a Firehouse Subs restaurant owner. First responders will receive a $100,000 cash incentive to help open their restaurant. Continue serving after service. Visit firehousesubsfranchising.com today.
Welcome back to another episode of Main Street Firefighting, a podcast by Fire Engineering. My name is Shady, and with me is my partner, Chris Tobin. Tonight, we're just doing a quick little podcast, kind of previewing some of the research and studying we've been doing on vacant buildings and kind of the moral dilemma behind them. And what we mean by that is everything that has to do with them, from the words we use to describe the buildings, to whether or not we're even going to enter the buildings, to the people who might be staying in them. And we've kind of self-titled this project, Project Vaco. We got that title from the homeless population themselves. They kind of had their own language when referring to these buildings, and they call them Vacos. And we kind of thought, what better way to kind of honor their perspective than to name this after them. So like I said, this is just kind of an entry into what we're talking about. We're really excited about the things that we're learning, and that we hope that this will, at least, if nothing else, generate some discussions in your firehouses and maybe on your shifts about how you yourselves approach them and kind of your perspective, and hopefully at least make you think. So anyways, we hope you enjoy the short discussion, and have a good night. So tonight we're going to do a little mini podcast, just kind of talking about some of the stuff we've been working on. We've been recently took on a project we're calling Project Vaco, which is kind of studying vacant buildings from a couple different perspectives, from the fire service perspective, from the perspective of the buildings themselves, and then from the perspective of the people who may be in those buildings. So we've kind of taken a roundabout view of these to try to kind of widen our perspective on what's going on with these buildings.
Yeah, like Lex was saying, we also took more of a scientific approach with this too, instead of just maybe writing an article or, unfortunately, operating on a bias that we might have. We used surveys as a technique. We did field research and really approached this from a professional manner. And the information that we got was really, really profound. And there's going to be a lot more to come out from the project in itself. And right now it's really open-ended, but it's just in the beginning phases of it. So some of the things that we found out concerning vacant buildings, especially how the fire service approaches them, and maybe what the overwhelming culture of vacant buildings are, is that we kind of have a lot wrong. We've gotten a lot wrong with how we perceive these buildings, and when we consider them vacant or when they appear to be vacant. And it really isn't that simple. It's very complex. So a couple of things that we found that we're going to hit on tonight in this quick little podcast is, the first thing that was problematic was just the vernacular that we use, or the descriptors that we use in these buildings. I think the word vacant is a universal descriptor. Not many departments, I know Wichita, maybe like the one exception that I know of for sure, uses the word, I believe, board up. So things like that, the descriptors, the language that you're using to describe the buildings, hugely problematic. So we can talk about that. Another one was the fact that the marking systems start to become problematic because of numerous problems. And by marking systems, it's what the National Fire Administration recommends. It's the standard marking system with the red X, and there might be tiers of high risk, low risk, medium risk, of interior conditions or exterior collapse potential. Whatever marking system you use, it's always in kind of a tiered manner for risk mitigation or risk hazard assessment. And those marking systems, while they have a very good intent, they seem to eventually become counterproductive, in that if you don't constantly keep them updated. I mean, constantly literally being like a weekly to monthly basis, because the environments are changing that rapidly, the way they rehab these buildings. Um, and then also the information you get for dispatching, what we're running into with our marking systems or our information that we have is that the caller might be in one address, so our fire alarm will convey the marking information, which there will be no call notes because the caller will be reporting from their location, but maybe the location that's actually on fire will have call notes, but we won't get that information because, well, that's not the address that was assigned to the call, or there may not even be an address. It may come in as an intersection, or the address just isn't marked on the building that's on fire, so we don't even know.
Or when you've had the building next door address called in and that has, a do not enter or the conditions are fine and the building itself is the opposite.
Yeah, so that's another thing too is mismatched conditions, right? So we get an address, and then we get notes on that saying that's a do not enter building. We show up and the building is completely fine. Well, now that's problematic because now what do you do as a first in company? So we've had all those things happen. So I think there definitely needs to be a discussion on if you do a marking system, that comes with some possible unintended consequences. That is, as long as you manage them, the market system is a really good thing and can work and does work. But I think a lot of places kind of knee jerk, and then all of a sudden they get themselves into a situation when they have an unmaintained marking system.
I think the marking systems need to be utilized as a reminder to pause and reassess the building before making any tactical decisions. Also, sometimes we see where the marking system information is sent out over the radio or over the CAD, and then you have battalion chiefs making decisions about tactics or what should or shouldn't be happening on the fire ground over the radio before they even see the building itself, which can be pretty problematic.
Also, like Lex was saying, it's generally better to use the marking system as just kind of like slow your roll. It's another kind of link in the information chain, right? It's not an end all be all. It should never determine entry or not. You should always have to do a size up regardless of what information you have. Obviously, the more information you have on the front end is always better, but you don't want to hamstring your companies with a do not enter no matter what kind of marking system. And unfortunately, that's kind of what happens. Not always, but it seems like that's very easy to let happen. We know from other cities too, from talking to friends of ours, I believe maybe up in Baltimore, once a building gets marked with the do not enter placard, or if there is a marking placard that you use that's visible to the public, well, the public isn't dumb about this. They'll use those buildings as for clandestine, whether it's a drug lab, or they'll be doing some behavior in those buildings because they know, well, we're not going to go in there. And so that is also a detriment to the neighborhood. And it just, once again, they're weaponizing that marking system for clandestine activity. So those are, once again, things that are unintended consequences of an unmaintained marking system. So the point is to if you do a marking system, which is always a good idea, because not only the benefits are the information on the front end, the huge benefit to the marking system is getting your members out in the street and canvassing the neighborhoods and getting eyes on the buildings, which just makes a fire department more knowledgeable, and it gives members more knowledge in the building construction side of things, and it gets the conversation going as opposed to just forgetting about them and being reactive once you're on scene.
Speaking of Baltimore, when we were out east, didn't they have a rescue out of a marked do not entry building?
Yeah, yes, they did. The same week that we were there presenting some of these um, findings that we found, they actually pulled n- numerous people out of a placarded "Do Not Enter" building. So, I mean, and there's that too. There's those rescues that are being made out of these "Do Not Enter" buildings, which could be its own podcast in itself, probably. But the million-dollar question is what happens even on that rescue? What happens when a member gets seriously injured or worse? Is that going to hold up legally? Those are all moral, ethical questions that really need to be posed on a legal platform. So when you placard a building, like, what does that mean from a legal standpoint? What does that mean from an ethical standpoint? Those are all things that really need to be defined in a policy instead of just a canned policy that's generic and ambiguous. All these details need to be hammered out beforehand.
So as we talked about earlier, when we started really kind of digging into, we call it the moral dilemma with vacant buildings, right? When we started really digging into this premise, we talked to individuals who may stay in these buildings, and we, during our discussions with them, which we'll get into more at a different time, we asked them like what they thought of, or if they even knew about the marking system of do not enter in the buildings. And we had two different responses. One was kind of like a shock that that we wouldn't go in after them, that wasn't even a thought to them, that we would have a building that we would not go look for them in. And then two was just the kind of premise of like, if they knew that that building was unsafe to be in, they might not even choose to stay in there either, that they didn't even understand that that was a concept that we had as a fire service.
Placarding systems come in kind of two different flavors. One is publicly optical and viewable, so that you can see there's a visible placard or marking. Might be a spray painted FD with an X through it, or a metal or whatever placard on the building itself that is visible to everyone. A lot of times those run into friction or protests by neighborhood associations or city councils or aldermen or something like that, because in areas that use these, there are typically high vacancies, and that starts to kind of, that's a bad optic on the neighborhood. So, um, in our case, there's the other version, which is just dispatch notes. So, you would get those notes that the building's been canvassed. It's either high, medium, or low risk, and that those notes are available to that first arriving company, or that initial response assignment, and that's broadcast over the radio. But that's not something that's known to the public. So, um, we don't really have the problems that those other places have with the placarded buildings that kind of attract some of the clandestine behaviors, or the homeless. But here's the flip side of that: is the vagrants who live in these buildings, they don't know, since it's not placarded, they don't know that they may be inhabiting a do not enter building. To them it seems fine, but there might be the back wall might be crumbling or missing, so that's not something we're going to mess with. That would be a do not enter building, and there could be three individuals living in there at any given time, and here we are showing up, and then we are not going in, and they're expecting us to go in and get them. And we know that for a fact now. Like, we've talked to these individuals, and they expect the fire department to enter the building like anyone else who is trapped in a building and do our job. So, something to kind of be concerned about, something to kind of talk about when you are doing these marketing systems, is what happens when you have an occupied do not enter building. That would be my question to ask, and that'd be something to kind of think about and figure out what occurs, what are the ramifications of that. And the $1 million question is, what happens when someone gets hurt trying to make a rescue on a do not enter building with confirmed entrapment. So, once again, all questions that are just kind of out there to dwell on. So the other big thing that we want to kind of hit on was what we're calling these buildings, and even just the words that we label these buildings as starts to influence the tactics and strategies that we use in these buildings. And whether you call them vacant, derelict, dilapidated, neglected, boarded up, all those words have a cost and a benefit. So you really have to weigh those out and how you do your responses. I know that in the city of St. Louis, we just call them vacant buildings, and the companies that are responding to those vacant fires more than not, they know better. Like, they know that when we say vacant, they know what that means, that there's more than likely people have been living in those. Primary searches and secondary searches are still going to get done if possible, and everything at the end of the day is as conditions dictate, which is how it should be. And a size up is going to get made. A size up is going to get made again, whether the second battalion chief gets on scene or the first battalion chief, they're going to be doing their size ups first in company, and so forth. So the big thing is just don't fall into like a strategic, rigid kind of system. You don't want to fall into that. But the big takeaway here is just when you use the word vacant, that's based off an appearance. That's not necessarily occupancy. A lot of people confuse vacancy with a structural integrity kind of metric. Maybe we should be using something else like derelict or dilapidated if that's what you're concerned about. So all things to consider. It's like what are the words doing to the tempo of the fire scene, and what are the words doing, and how are the words influencing the descriptors? How do those words influence the response? I guess that would be the question to answer.
A lot of what we look at when we talk about this kind of stuff is kind of from like a psychology viewpoint. And a lot of people may think like, well, the word doesn't really matter. If we understand that we're going to search everything, then who cares if we use the word vacant? But when you're under that like stress of responding to a fire, like subconsciously your body and your mind is going to react to words differently. And the definition of vacant is defined as having no fixtures, furniture, or inhabitants. It's an empty building. So when you hear that, you're automatically going to think there's no one in there. And then you're going to have to readjust your thinking and then go in and do a search. Where if we start referring to these buildings based on the construction and the conditions, like using words such as derelict, which is defined as a poor condition as a result of disuse or neglect, then you're not having to readjust your thinking. You're just automatically ready to go. A couple other things with this. I know some people listening might think that this is just a St. Louis problem, a St. Louis, entering suburb problem, a Baltimore problem, whatever. Well, that's not true. Like, frankly, I don't care if you're in a suburb, if you're in a small town America, like you have vacant buildings somewhere. People who live in these buildings, the unhoused or homeless population, they travel. They move around based on weather, family conditions. They're trying to find jobs, whatever. We were in a small town in Illinois a couple years ago, doing a Main Street class, walking the streets. There was a building that looked derelict. There was a wall that was kind of bowing out, pretty poor condition. The chief there pointed at it and said, absolutely, under no conditions is anyone entering this building. This is a do not enter building for me. Door was open. We made our way upstairs just to take a peek at what the building was like. The back door was propped open, and then there was multiple signs of occupancy from food, discarded food, trash, signs of some kind of burning, whether it was warming, cooking fire. So, I mean, that was a small town of like 1,000 people in rural Illinois, and they clearly had someone living in that building.
Like you just said, that was kind of an eye opener for that chief, and it wasn't. It was someone was living in that building like right then. Like it was clearly inhabited. It wasn't like something that had happened long ago, and that's something that we've come across over and over and over again when we do these small town Main Street classes. Is there homeless people are everywhere, and they inhabit buildings where they can, especially if your town is on a rail line or a highway, which is pretty much everyone. Um, that is just kind of a main conduit of the unhoused population. No, not the town that we live in. Um, we had quite a few vacant buildings that they were going to use for training, and that is something that people don't realize is how fast a building goes from occupied to vacant, how fast that building becomes occupied again with an unhoused occupant or vagrancy. In the case of the town that we live in, it was within a span of weeks. All the boards, it was a hospital, which what happens, it was a hospital was clearing a portion of a neighborhood for parking. So they had about a half dozen houses that were sold, boarded up professionally, and within literally 2 weeks, boards are pried off and warming fires were being built inside one or two of these houses. So that's something that I would have never thought would have occurred in this town, which doesn't have any sort of vacant building problem or any sort of socioeconomic issue. But there it was, just like that. So it's just something to think about. Like she said, it is definitely not an urban decay problem. It is it is an American problem.
I mean, we can provide example after example of this, and you can talk to other firefighters in your area. One other big example I can think of in my city is we had a seafood grocery store was shut down for a couple different reasons. And when they shut it down, they just turned the power off and left everything inside. So you can imagine the smell. It got cleaned out a little bit, but basically it was still left as it is. We had a call there, and you wouldn't think anyone would want to live in a building like that, and people were pouring out of the back of the building. So they're going to find whatever conditions they can, whatever form of shelter, no matter what, to get into to protect themselves. And we just have to understand that. I know we all say, we talk a big game that we're going to search for them, we're going to do stuff for them. But when it really comes down to it, are we really?
So something else that we kind of realized too is that there is kind of an ebb and flow in the way that these unhoused populations occupy their and habitate in these buildings, to where it depends on where you live, which ones. So warmer climates, obviously, they have more, like, people living under overpasses, or living in tents, homeless encampments like that. And then the places where it gets colder, they definitely inhabit the buildings on a much more common factor, larger scale. And they do, from speaking to them, they do actually have a time of year where they start moving into the buildings, which is about now, autumn, Thanksgiving-ish, between Halloween and Thanksgiving. They're going to be moving back into the buildings, obviously for warmth and shelter. They can build their warming fires inside the buildings and not grab attention from the authorities, as opposed to warming fire out in the open air. Someone's going to call that in, they're going to see it. So all things to consider. If you live somewhere, if you have a homeless encampment or a homeless shelter that has been shut down, a homeless encampment that's been cleared out, maybe the next town did that. Those people are going to go somewhere, and they will find buildings to inhabit. That is something that we've definitely found out to be true. And like we talked to a couple other people that work as firefighters in medium-sized cities in Missouri here, to where the next town over essentially cleared their homeless population out of the town, and then their town that they work in, and basically adopted the homeless population as vagrants inside their building. So they started to see more and more homeless people living inside their buildings, just because the town over decided to clear them out, clear their homeless encampment. Maybe that town didn't have the resources for a shelter. So all things to consider is you have to have a pulse on your homeless population to kind of see what's going on, where their movements are, what their habits are, and then get out. And the big thing here is get out and talk to them. Get out and talk to the homeless people. Ask the questions: where are they staying? How do you pick the buildings that you stay in? How many people are staying in these buildings? Those are all questions that you should already be ready to ask when you come across these individuals, usually on EMS runs. And EMS is a really good way to get some recon, some really good front-loaded information on this whole kind of subject.
And as far as like EMS calls go, even if you're in charge of, patient care, whether it's on the ambulance or you're waiting for your ambulance to arrive, obviously call and patient status dependent, right? But you can still use those times to talk to them. So I've had multiple conversations with people about, like, do you have a place to stay? Where is it you're staying? How do you make yourself safe there? Do you feel safe there? Do you have people you stay with? How do you contact people? All of that kind of stuff gives us an idea of what to look for in the future when we're going on calls, right? And when we talk to these people, then we can kind of pay attention to maybe certain sections of the city that they might be more likely to stay in. One guy told us that they really like to pick areas of convenience, right? And so areas of convenience to them meant near food pantries, near bus stops, near gas stations. So buildings near those areas were more likely to be occupied. Also depends on your city, right? Like he was talking about earlier, if you have a tent encampment, you may not have as many people in the buildings, outside of the colder times of the year. If you have a city that the police are really pushing trespassing, that was one of the big things that they talked about with us. A lot of people had been arrested in the past for getting trespassing tickets for being inside residential buildings. So they were erring more to the side of staying in vacant commercials. So that was all kind of stuff that we didn't know until we actually got out and talked to the people in our area.
So yeah, just kind of wrapping this up here. That was really, we just wanted to hit on three kind of issues with the the moral dilemma and the project Vaco that we're doing, which is have a discussion on the pros and cons of marketing systems. Have a discussion on the descriptors and the semantics and those words that you're using to describe the buildings that we're talking about: the neglected building, the derelict building, the vacant building, the board up. Those words do matter. And then have a discussion on what happens when you come across these individuals, the unhoused population. Try to get their perspective from things. Do you have a method of gaining information from these individuals? Because right until now, they're really the one aspect, the one piece of the puzzle that's been left out of the narrative in the fire service. There's always the should we go in, should we not go in, and then well, no one's ever talked to the people who were actually in there. So that was really the three kind of things we wanted to hit on this little quick mini episode here. But there's a lot more to this that's soon to come. And we're going to keep building on what we've stumbled upon, which is, like we had talked about before, a very profound amount of information and really insightful kind of information and material that we're gaining from these individuals.
If you ask me, what was one of the most impactful days of my fire service career, it was definitely the day we went out and just talked to the people. And if you really want to know what they think, ask them what they expect of the fire department. We ask people that when we go to, trunk or treats and block parties, and when they come to the firehouse, we'll have that conversation. But I don't know that many people have asked the homeless population what they want from the fire department, and giving them the opportunity to tell us was really insightful. We learned a lot. So like you said, that's all we've got for you tonight. We're excited to hopefully share some more. If you guys have stories related to this subject, we would love, or fires where you've talked to people afterwards, rescued people, whatever, and these kind of buildings, we would love to hear your story as well. Thanks again for listening to another episode of Main Street Firefighting, a podcast by Fire Engineering. Once again, we'd like to thank them for the opportunity and you all for tuning in. We hope this at least, like I said, generates some discussion and thoughts with your crews. And like I said, if you have information or anything you'd like to discuss, especially if you guys have had rescues or anything on the typical Main Street buildings that we normally talk about, we'd love to hear it. Until then, we'll see you next time.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with Magnegrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit magnegrip.com.
Attention first responders, ready for a new challenge? You can turn your leadership skills into deliciousness by becoming a Firehouse Subs restaurant owner. First responders will receive a $100,000 cash incentive to help open their restaurant. Continue serving after service. Visit firehousesubsfranchising.com today.